many of you are not in a position yet where you're necessarily like in charge of a lab, or none of you are like, say, in charge of a lab, creating the direction of, a large research agenda, but I imagine many of you hope to do that in the future. And so a lot of what I'm sharing here is to give you tools so that you will have more options as you move towards those future career pathways and thinking about what kind of directions your research can go. So the agenda we're going to be following is, first, I'm going to talk about assumptions, then some foundational concepts that kind of are basing this work. And then finally, what kind of actions you can take. I really like to let people know, like, here's some very concrete things that you can do either now or in the future. And then you'll engage in some smaller group discussion. We'll probably divide you all into 2 groups so you can kind of have a smaller, more intimate discussion, and then we'll have a closing. So the first part here I wanted to share is, what are some of the assumptions that are coming into this workshop? The material you're going to hear today is based on research from outside of your fields, coming from places more like, feminist theory, ethnic studies, science and technology studies, and other social science fields that are really looking at categories of difference, identity, and power. And these are all things that are highly relevant in virtually all research fields in some way, shape, or form, even if it's not immediately obvious. So coming from that place, I'm going to share some sort of like grounding assumptions. These may not all be assumptions that you all agree with or fully understand. What I do want to say is these are all assumptions that are grounded in a very large body of research. And I will be sharing at the end of this series quite a number of resources so that you can learn more about this as you're interested. The first thing I want to share as an assumption is the lack of diversity that we often see in science, and therefore in who is deciding what questions are valid to ask or how we engage with communities. This lack of diversity is due to systemic deficits. Oftentimes when we talk about diversity, people talk about it in terms of like there's something like the individuals need to act differently. They need to get higher test scores. They need to, get better education, and all of these things may have, sure, there may be something to that. But what's more important is the sort of like, are the systemic deficits. Why do we care about test scores so much? Why are some people not getting as good an education in the first place? Why are we valuing certain things over certain types of knowledge over other? And that those things are really needed to change if we want to address issues of diversity. And then as an example of this, we also assume that scientific norms and culture are based in. And when I say based in, I mean that, historically, this is in the roots of where science as a culture came from. And these roots include white supremacy, colonialism, and patriarchy. Now, that doesn't mean that we're like we're intentionally carrying that with us today. And this is why I say research culture is often unintentionally exclusionary. I don't think that any PIs, researchers, whatnot, are trying to keep people out explicitly these days. And yet that often still is the result. So this is an unintentional exclusion. And it's because of the histories of where these fields are coming from. So therefore, these histories of exclusion are not our fault. Like feeling guilt or put upon it, like somehow there's finger being pointed at us because we're a part of this and other people are not. That's not helpful. What is helpful is to focus on the responsibility that we do have to create a culture of greater inclusion. What can we do to address this unintentional exclusion that sometimes happens because of these histories? How can we change that? So I'm going to say a little bit about some of these histories now, just so you get a little background. I'm going to go through this, given everything I'm going to say, it's going to go fairly quickly. So I kind of advise just kind of like grab onto whatever, sort of resonates with you. I also want to acknowledge that for some individuals coming into these conversations, what I'm sharing may be like really clear to you. And this may feel, this may be material you already know. So I want to acknowledge that we're kind of we want to make space for a wide variety of where people are at, whether this is sort of like old news or if this is something you haven't really thought about before in this conversation, and that both can exist. So first, I want to say a bit about the whiteness of science. One scholar of race, George Lipsitz, said, whiteness is everywhere in American culture, but it is very hard to see. And so what this means when we talk about science is that, the sort of white figure, whether this is who we imagine as the researcher, who we imagine we're researching, is often presumed to be white. I mean, we're seeing a lot of, research, particularly in medicine, coming out around this, showing how, say, like the pulse oximeters that have been widely used especially earlier in the pandemic, don't work as well on dark skin than they do on white skin. There is a history around that exists because whiteness was the default. And I could give lots and lots of other examples, and maybe y'all can just like think if you've heard of those before, but this is just an example of what I mean. Another example is masculinity has also been a default in science, not only because we have the sort of white male scientist as a sort of prototypical figure, but also in terms of what's considered the norms of the field are shaped around that. The sort of schedules that we're often required to adhere to, both in science and medicine, are not schedules that are very amenable to caretaking, for example. But it also is reflected in who the presumed subject and beneficiary of science is. And so, I'm sure many of you are familiar with histories where, say, like the symptoms of a heart attack the symptoms that many people knew about in terms of how to know if you're having a heart attack were very gendered. And so the sort of like, left side paralysis would be much more common in men than women, and the sort of symptoms that women had were not highly known. That's just one small example among, again, many others. When we're talking about science and medicine, we're also talking about systems that have a foundation in colonialism. And I include this quote here by Sir Ronald Ross from 1899. In the coming century, the success of imperialism will depend largely upon the success of the microscope. Now, the reason he said this was because at that time, the microscope was crucial for the studies of tropical diseases. The reason they needed to study tropical diseases was so that the British colonialists could better survive the tropical areas in which they were, in which their colonies existed. And so it sort of is like their supremacy in that space rested upon scientific discovery. And so much of early science was the early scientific questions that were asked to uphold the goals of colonialism. And we can continue to see this in many settler colonial states in terms of what questions are most considered most prominent are often the questions and concerns of settler colonial nations. And then the final foundation I want to mention is a foundation in eugenics. What you see here is an image from the, I believe, 1932 from the International Eugenics Congress. And it says, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and gives them organic unity and purpose. So this was sort of like the big vision of science that was actually quite mainstream at that time. You can see all sorts of different fields sort of, funneling up into the study of eugenics. Now, today, I imagine that none of us are really interested in studying eugenics, and we understand how that is, fundamentally, a racist and highly discriminatory framework. And yet, because it was the sort of framing model when many disciplines were coming into being, there are sort of like remnants of eugenics still within many disciplines. And finally, alongside all of these trends, we often simultaneously saw an erasure of that type of person that didn't sort of fit into this sort of stereotypical who should be a scientist, who gets to be an expert. So it made the accomplishments of many scientists erased, downplayed, or otherwise appropriated. An example of this is Indigenous peoples' contributions to the absolute explosion of discovery that happened during colonialism. Their role was ignored. And in fact, it was they were often exploited in that process. Black people's innovations were often ignored. Women's contributions were appropriated or downplayed. Similarly, the benefits are gendered and racialized, and where expertise relies has been historically gendered and racialized. And it's like this where expertise lies that will kind of be, and benefits is what we'll kind of be thinking about a lot in this series. So I'm going to pause now, and I am going to launch a poll. And I invite you all to, I'll read the questions and I invite you all to respond as you're able here. So, I'm wondering, how much do you know about the history of inequity in your area of research? And you can choose, I know the history of my specific fields and apply this in my research. I know the history in my specific field. So the first one's sort of like you learned it and it's impacting how you do your work. The second one is like, you know a good amount about it. The third one is, the general histories of inequity in science and medicine. And the last is, I just don't know much about this. I will say this is an anonymous poll, so whatever you say, nobody's going to know who said what. I do encourage you to go ahead and jump in there. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes while you all get a chance to participate. Okay, and so while so I'm going to right now move on to like section 2, thinking about foundational concepts. So we're going to talk about 3 main foundational concepts and then sort of like one other general idea I want to get across. The first is the matrix of domination, and then design justice, and then community-based participatory research. So you can kind of see this like image, next to there. You see some of the things I just talked about. They say heteropatriarchy, so kind of bringing sexuality into there too, which, is very valid, and we could talk about that. White supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism as well, and how these sort of things all impact, identity and how we are read in the world, how other people respond, how we respond to other people in the world. And so that kind of is like lays the groundwork for thinking about what is the matrix of domination. And I should, before I really jump into this, I also want to say, again, this is kind of another time when giving a bunch of information, this may or may not be all, some of you may already be familiar with a lot of it, which is great. For those of you that aren't, I encourage you to just kind of like notice which of these frameworks I provide feels the most compelling to you. Like, which of these are you hearing and you're like, oh, I would like to think more about that, because that's kind of more why I'm sharing this, not so you'll kind of like know and remember and memorize all of this, but more just so you're kind of aware of some different frameworks that you can bring into your research. And, and again, just think if you can grab one that feels particularly interesting to you, that's what I encourage you to do here. Okay, so the first one I want to highlight is this idea of like what's called the matrix of domination. And here you have sort of like these Patricia Hill Collins, she's a Black feminist scholar. She talks about these like multiple levels upon which, oppression and equity can operate. There's like the personal level, kind of like how do you think about things? This is kind of like where individual bias kind of exists. We have lots of conversations about personal level often in our culture. And then there's also the level of sort of like community. And here's where I'd put sort of like how one's lab operates within maybe at like professional conferences and stuff like that. And there's ways that you can kind of, see how inequity operates and maybe work to change it. And then you have sort of like more the institutional. which here we have sort of like, how does the university operate? How do systems of the government operate? We could even talk about like cultural sort of norms and whatnot at this level. So, but the point is to kind of like think across these so that you can understand how making an intervention at one level, while helpful, is limited, and we really need interventions at all levels. This next framework I'm now sharing is like a framework, coming from design justice. And what I'm kind of sharing here is like different ways of thinking about how we engage with communities in our research. So I made this little triangle. This is adapted from, two different systems. One is Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation. The other is Costanda's-Chalk's expansion on the work in design justice. So, okay, you take this little triangle and you see in the bottom, at the left-hand corner, I have something I labeled extraction exploitation. Think of this as sort of like, if you ever heard the term like parachuting in sort of research, like when you come into a community and you say, okay, this is what we need from you, and we get it, and then we kind of pull out. That would be one model of doing community-based research, well, of doing research in a community, I should say. On the lower right-hand side, we have a corner where I put manipulation or degradation. This is when people make, this is kind of how a well-intentioned goal of educating people may sometimes be felt. So people say, oh, we just want to educate people on how to eat better and then it'll get better. This is kind of one manipulative because it's, well, or I should just say, maybe manipulative is a little too harsh a word, but it's a little presumptuous, because that assumes that that's really the problem. And if they just knew how to eat better, then they'd be healthier. Or it can also be degrading and saying, just coming and be like, hey, you don't know how to do this, and we're going to tell you. Again, it's just kind of like a bit condescending, at least, and that is how it's often experienced by many communities. Apologies. And then if we go up a little level, we can look at this model of like being on a more informing or consulting level. That's when there's kind of like more of a conversation with the community. Think of it more like a dialogue. There's some sort of clear exchange. It may be still transactional. Like you may just say like, okay, they say, yes, we will do this and we want you to pay us, or we want to have this in exchange. And that's great. That's kind of moving up a level, because the community is having a voice in the matter, and it still may not be sort of like a deep relationship of trust, but at least the community is getting something out of it. And then at the top level is a relationship of shared power and partnership. And that's where like the community is getting to say like, hey, these are the questions that we think are important to ask, and we'd like to see you asking these questions. And you're working with them at every stage in the research process. And they get in a sense as much benefit out of it as the researchers do. An immediate benefit, I should add. Okay, so third concept, we had matrix of domination, design justice. Now, community-based participatory research. This term is what's called often sort of like that top level of engaged research that I talked about in the last slide. Here we see the community as an active partner with the researcher. The community guides the research questions. There's an ongoing process of consent between the researcher and not just the individual, but also the community. And both the process and the results have a direct impact on the community. And you see here, an image from the Kettleman City down in the Central Valley, a site of a lot of environmental justice, a lot of health inequities, that has, pushed against the toxins and the sort of unequal conditions in which they've been subjected. And in many of these communities, particularly those that have been subject to historic inequities, they already are doing research. And this is where I think this is kind of like a really important point that I think a lot of us as researchers coming in from the outside, or me speaking of one perhaps, that's not the case for all of you, and I want to acknowledge that, is that many researchers don't think about, researchers who aren't coming from these communities. We see, for example, the Black Panthers did an immense amount of work furthering public health and studying the impacts of different programming on overall public health. We also, many environmental justice advocates have done and continue to do research assessing toxins in their community and the health impacts. I was just on a call earlier today with an individual who was talking about the air quality monitoring trainings that they do so that communities can do their own research about the quality of their air and then advocate with those tools. Okay, so I'm now going to share, I'm going to pause and I'm going to share the poll back to you all. Thank you all who participated. And we can see that most of you are on the pretty much the same page here. You know, the general history of inequity in science and medicine, not necessarily of your specific field. And that's, I'd say, you know, you're not alone in this. You can see obviously within this group, but I would even say in general for many researchers in STEM. And this is great because this lets us know where we need to go from here. And so we can say, okay, we'll be providing with you at the end of this series some resources of, you know, where you can learn more. So that's like one direction, you know, I hope some of you will consider taking after, you know, beyond this series. Okay, now I'm going to open up another poll. And here I have two questions for you all. The first one is, does your research engage with communities? You can choose, yes, I am very engaged with communities. You can choose, yes, I am somewhat engaged with communities. No, but I'd like to be in the future, or no, and I have no plans to do so. And any of these are, you know, obviously, you know, valid answers. This is also just to kind of help us, you know, kind of see where folks are at. And then the second question that I have there is asking which of those concepts that I just discussed resonates with you the most. The concept of matrix of domination, design justice, and the sort of, you know, models of community participation, community-based research, or research conducted by communities. I'm going to go through the next section. Oh, I should have switched slides over so you can see. I'm going to go over into the next section that kind of is going now into like I've shared all this information now, like what can you do with this? I'm going to give you sort of like some really concrete actions that you can think about taking either now or in the future. And while I'm doing this, I encourage you to like ask yourself, like, what is like something I could do as a follow-up to this workshop, either now again, or at some point in the future. Okay. So first thing I want to suggest is to know local history. And when I say local history, I'm being a little loose with the term here. It could mean, one, if you're doing research in a specific space, to learn about the community before you arrive. It could also mean to know the sort of like specific history of your field or of particular research techniques that you're undertaking. All these things can be really valuable. And I'm going to share a quote from a research study that I did. And this, you know, looking at best practices in community engagement. And this participant said, it's not an accident that today, and this I should say is a city in California in Central Valley. It's not an accident that today we rank as the most heavily polluted community in the entire state of California. It's not an accident that we see Black infant mortality rates that are really at or higher than third world country levels in our neighborhood, that we see the highest concentrated poverty rates, that we see a 20-year life gap in terms of life expectancy between the neighborhood they're in and other parts of the city. So you can imagine if a researcher came in and didn't know this context and started having a conversation, that they may make mistakes and may not be well received based on mistakes they make. And so this is kind of just a quote to demonstrate like how important knowing the sort of context in which you're moving is needed. The next kind of thing I want to suggest you can do is to think about how you can respect community organizing. This is an aspect of working with communities that I find often gets overlooked, is that most communities got organized, created these sort of community-based organizations in part because of histories of neglect, including from the research community, including from the medical system and many other, areas of benefit that others have benefited from. So that means that the community groups that now, as researchers, we want to build relationships with and get them to like trust us, they formed in the first place because they were being neglected by the very systems and institutions that we are now representing. And I'm saying this in a very, again, broad sense. This can get much more complex in just as just as convoluted ways if, say, the person is coming historically from those communities. There's different dynamics that arise then. But in any case, that's something that's just really important to acknowledge, because as, again, a quote from another participant in this research study I did said, you engage with community-based organizations because they have this constituency, like they have people you want to reach, and they have this point of view. Then you tell them, in order to come in other words, to come into a research partnership, you have to leave your point of view at the door. Just give us your constituency. And we see this oftentimes where research institutions may not want to engage in sort of like politics or the advocacy. And that's understandable, but we need to simultaneously respect that the CBOs, that's a core part of their mission, and we can't ask them to leave that behind. Another thing I want to suggest is the importance of providing fair compensation. And this is not just to like individuals, but also often to communities, because oftentimes when you're doing community engaged research, you need to work with local organizations. And here's one quote someone shared. I think most people assume that community engagement is easy, or it's low cost or free, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, when you're engaging, especially communities that are low income or communities that are predominantly communities of color, it actually requires a lot more resources. So I wanted to bring this up because, again, I know a lot of you may not be at the stage now where you're writing your own research grants, but when you are, this is something to keep in mind, to remember to write in funding for community organizations that you want to work with, not just for individual compensation, but also for at the level of the organization. Next thing that you can do, and this is something that's very tangible, I think everyone can work on right now, is to translate technical jargon. In other words, figure out how to translate what you do to, sort of like an everyday audience or a specific audience that you want to reach. There's actually a great example of grad students doing this at the Grad Slam event that's coming up in a few weeks, when people kind of share what they do in their research in 3 minutes. But in a broader sense, what I'd share is that you can think about if people can't really understand what you're doing, one, they're much less likely to care about it. Two, they can't really give full consent. They can't really enter into full partnership if they don't really understand, if you can't really communicate what you're doing. And again, we can't necessarily say, oh, well, they need to have a certain level of education to understand it. No. We need to be able, if we can't communicate it, that is our limitation, and we need to figure out how to rectify that. And we can see this in a couple quotes, again, from the same research study. Transparency means being able to explain technical things in a way that's actually accessible, because the technical jargon we use is a way of gatekeeping people from knowledge. And goes on, without people being able to make an informed decision, it's not consensual. Consent is a big part of that in a larger picture. Withholding information is non-consensual. And this can be incredibly important. We're talking about, translational research, clinical research. People need to know what they're really signing up for and what kind of benefits they can really, really expect, both at the individual level, but also at the community level. Finally, the last thing I want to point out is there's opportunities to take opportunities to continue collaboration. Oftentimes we end up as researchers being really subject to sort of like grant deadlines, the sort of, project end dates. Communities don't that's not how you build trust, and that's not sort of how you can build a sustainable relationship with a community. And so it requires us to think creatively about how we can sort of balance those different tensions. And one framework that I like to advocate for this is thinking about how research can itself be a part of like movement work. In other words, movement work as collective action towards change. A really great example of this, of something that many of us can get behind, is sort of like we see vast health inequities in our society right now in the US. And we may want to, and beyond, and we may want to do something about that. And that's the kind of, we could think about like, how can we work with communities to enact change around that? We have a specific role, they have a specific role, our roles are different, and yet how can we move together to make that change? So, okay, I'm going to pause here. I'm going to share this last poll. And I asked, does your research engage with communities? We say we have 1 person very engaged, 2 somewhat engaged, 6 are interested in the future. So this is great. I hope this is helpful for y'all to think about that. Which concepts resonate with you the most? We see design justice and community-based participatory research resonate the most, with 3 each, and then matrix of domination, and then research conducted by communities. So thank you all. That's great to see. Now I have one question here. This is, you know, kind of a bit wordy, but we'll give you all some time with this. Which of the following actions are you most likely to take? 1, learning more about histories of inequity. 2, learning more about community organizing. And you can choose as many as you want, by the way, you don't have to just pick one. Learning more about community organizing, seeking funding to provide compensation for community partners, exploring new ways to communicate my research to new audience, finding new research partners located in communities most impacted by inequity, or none of the above. So I'll leave that up for a few moments while I'm going to just share kind of like some key takeaways and move us towards small group discussions. So key takeaways that I'd like for you to think about as you move into smaller group discussions is think about how you can partner with communities as equals. So this means knowing local history, respecting their expertise, and compensating them fairly. We also encourage you to think about how you can move with humility. And this means listening to the people that you work with, translating jargon, and moving outside the project scope, if possible, to acknowledge and rectify community concerns. Sometimes communities, they're like, well, it's great you're doing this thing, but we want to talk about this other thing. And making space for that as much as is possible can really help to build community trust. Also, the importance of maintaining relationships with communities across projects. And this also means making research results relevant and useful to the community. And finally, think about how research can be a part of movement work. Communities are a key part of research, and research is a key part of shaping our future communities. So I'm going to now give you some questions to, now you'll move into small groups, and when you move into the groups, we're gonna break you up into, I believe, 2 groups. You will each have a facilitator in the room. Half of you will be with Emily, the other half will be with Diana. And when you're in there, you're welcome to discuss any of the materials that we've talked about in here. I'm going to give you some, kind of broad questions to consider that can sometimes kind of is a helpful starting place. But again, once you get in with your facilitators, it's really up to you all and the facilitator where you want to move the conversation. What I hold as a goal for this is helping for you all to kind of share the knowledge that you have about the issues we're talking about, so you can learn from each other and think about how specifically this applies in the type of research you all are doing and hope to do in the future. So, just some questions to think about. One question: who is your research for and why? So this could be the research you do now, or the sort of aspirational research you want to do in the future. This kind of comes back to that question of who benefits, who's the presumed subject. Two, think about how might you collaborate with communities more deeply in your research. Again, this could be now or with imagined future projects you'd like to do. Three, where is your research investing, building capacity, and resourcing? This is like a big thing I didn't talk too much about, but I do want to highlight, which is that research partnerships work best when they are immediately giving back to the community, when they are investing in the community, they are building capacity in the community or otherwise resourcing them so that they have, the community in turn has more autonomy as well. And finally, what work would you need to do? What would you need to do now to be a better partner in your current community or in the community you hope to work with in the future?